The William Blake poem I'm going to talk about is called The Garden of Love. Garden seems to be a simple word, a word that is which we can understand without puzzling over it too much. And so in a way it is. If I tell you I'm just going out to fetch something from the garden, you'll know what I mean, even if you've no exact notion of what that garden looks like or where it is in relation to where I'm sitting. In that context, garden doesn't mean much because it doesn't have to mean very much. What about, though, something calling itself the Garden of Love? Here, I suspect your first inclination would not be to wonder what that garden contains in the way of actual planting. Are there roses, trees and shrubs perhaps? Has he remembered to cut the grass? But to ask why this garden might be called a garden of love. Something symbolic must be going on. At any rate, it is the word love that seizes the attention rather than the word garden. But then gardens have a way of turning out to be symbolic in literature, just as they do, in fact, in visual art. In English poetry alone, the Renaissance and the medieval period are both full of what we might identify as allegorical gardens, gardens that mean things. These are places apt for poetic description. Think of all those blooms and greenery that have far from just botanical meanings. The Elizabethan poet Edmund Spenser, for example, has major garden set pieces in his enormously long, but not even remotely finished epic, The Faerie Queene. One of these Spenser calls the Bower of Bliss. The hero there, a male knight called Sir Guyon, enters it and is soon enticed by the sexual delights that are figured also in the entire garden's design. There the most dainty paradise on ground itself doth offer to his sober eye, in which all pleasures plenteously abound, and none does others' happiness envy. The painted flowers, the trees up shooting high, the dales for shade, the hills for breathing space, the trembling groves, the crystal running by, and that which all fair works doth most grace, the art which all that wrought, appeared in no place. It sounds lovely, but Sir Guyon, who nearly succumbs to the potent charms of a voluptuous nymph there by the name of Acrasia, ends up laying waste violently to the whole thing. But all those pleasant bowers and palace brave Guyon broke down with rigour pitiless. Now aught their goodly workmanship might save them from the tempest of his wrathfulness, but that their bliss he turned to balefulness. Their groves he felled, their gardens did deface, their arbours spoiled, their cabinets suppress, their banquet houses burn, their buildings raze, and of the fairest late now made the foulest place. William Blake knew Spenser's work, and as a visual artist, Blake produced a large-scale painting with a panoramic assembly of characters from the Faerie Queene. It's now in the collection of Petworth House. And even painted a portrait, necessarily an imaginative one, of Spenser himself. So Blake's Garden of Love could well stand in some relation to Spenser and his love-filled but doom-destined bower, but only once that garden has been long despoiled. The Garden of Love, from Blake's Songs of Experience, is an overgrown and a desolate place. So I turn to the Garden of Love, that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. The graves and the tombstones make this a garden of death, not love. And this triggers less poetic associations, which, unlike the Spencerian ones, Blake is better able to take for granted and to rely upon. For death had come into a garden before, in the book of Genesis, and the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed, Genesis 2:8. In this garden, after Eve and Adam, in disobedience to God, eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they themselves suddenly recognize their own nakedness and attempt to cover it, in Genesis 3:7, and are both severely reprimanded and punished by God, their Creator, Genesis 3:17-19. And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou earn bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Thou shalt not isn't just the formula of the Ten Commandments, but the wording of this primal commandment in the garden. Eden itself is blighted by the disobedience, and sexuality, as figured by nakedness, becomes both self-conscious and part of a general sorrow that includes both male and female kinds of labour. The garden of love becomes choked with thorns and thistles. All of this Blake's poem has absorbed, and other poems in his Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience are similarly in the orbit of this imagery and symbolic meaning. The chapel in the Garden of Love is a place of forbidding and strict prohibition, so strict indeed that it forbids even its own entrance. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. What is forbidden, also, is unmistakably love itself. This becomes visually obvious once we see Blake's illuminated page, where the poem is engraved in the midst of a large pictorial design. Here, almost the whole of the top half is occupied by three kneeling figures, a priest and a young girl and boy, who seem to be praying in front of old tombstones. All three are outside what looks like a chapel, with heads bowed. The priest has his eyes fixed on his open book, and the young girl and boy look down to the ground. It is as though they are praying to the dead, or to death itself. From the ground, which stretches to frame the page, are spreading green tendrils that, when we look closely, have briar-like thorns. They enter the text of the poem, a text that seems to be in or under the ground on which the three figures kneel. They reach into the spaces between its stanzas, and they invade the letters of its very title. Blake's symbolic understanding of a garden of love is complicated, but one of its simpler foundations is the belief that sexuality's repression generates desolation. Spencer, in the 16th century, might have expected readers to cheer when Sir Guion demolishes that sensual bower. But Blake, 200 years later, has an entirely different angle on things, and he allows us to feel with a cold, damp, clinging chill the death that breathes through sexual denial and proscription. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. You can hear, and because you can hear, you can feel how tightly prohibition binds the natural self here. Those final two lines do not join in the pattern of end rhyming that the rest of the poem has established, but collapse their rhymes inwards. Gowns, rounds, briars, desires. There is nowhere to look, nowhere to listen outside the chant of these lines. It is a devastatingly closed and grim denial of any larger vista. But it is not the whole story. For a start, as readers, or rather as readers of both a poetic and a visual kind of text, we can see what the kneeling boy and girl cannot: a symbolic landscape whose ruination and whose death devotion we are in a position to observe, and for which we may understand the causes. Also, Blake has planted in even this barren and overrun garden one of his most potently flourishing words, in joys. For Blake, joys aren't joys if we decide to confine them. They're not to be bound up with us and our preconceptions, but allowed to fly free so that they can be seen and welcomed. Binding, then, is never the end of the matter, and never the only option. The point is made in a notebook quatrain poem of Blake's, where a true garden of love is confidently imagined. He who binds to himself a joy doth the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. Notice how the rhythm of that crucial third line achieves a fluttering lift-off from the trudging metre of the lines just before it. Spenser's bower and the garden of Genesis had locations, and they were laid waste. Blake's true garden of love, on the other hand, has no location, because it is everywhere, in an eternity where joy is not to be caught and tied down, but kissed in acceptance as it flies freely to nowhere. The Garden of Love. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green, and the gates of this chapel were shut, and "Thou shalt not" writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires.